technologies, there would be barriers. It can be racial, it can be ethnic, it can be socioeconomic, it can be differently abled. There will be barriers, a technological barrier, which will prevent them from accessing these technologies and not create, but exacerbate the current health disparities that are prevalent. As an example, I wanted to show you an investigation that was done by ProPublica. I would encourage you to read it. It goes by machine bias. And they were able to show that when artificial intelligence was used in the criminal justice system to predict sentencing for different people who are arrested for different sort of offenses, it's very clear that the algorithm was predicting a much worse outcome for a person from a minority background, even though the offenses were pretty much similar. And this raised a lot of concern in the legal community, but at the same time, this has a lesson for the medical community that if we are not careful about how we are developing these systems, this would have effect on how we are making predictions about diagnosis and other things for the patients. Related to this, it would be worthwhile to mention that even now, certain textbooks have information that is in complete opposition to what we know from evidence. Certain textbooks still talk about how certain minorities, certain populations are more predisposed to certain diseases when they're actually not. It's just that because you see these patients more, it is a belief that they are the ones having it, that the prevalence of that disease is more in that patient population, which is not the case. So what is happening? Why are such outcomes possible? What is happening in some of these data sets is that when you train these technologies with a population that does not represent our society, from a racial background, from an ethnic background, sexual orientation, gender identity, it is prone to give you output that is discriminatory, that is going to show you a certain outcome that does not represent the society at large. So these deficiencies in the way we create these data sets is causing most of these problems. So my research in this space has basically tried to understand what can we really do. And this is a part of some of my academic work. And the idea here is that, I call it recode, but the idea here is that we need to do better research, better contextualization, and better development of these systems. And what do I mean by that? So the first part is the research aspect. Why? To try to really understand, before we develop these systems for patients, why are we developing these systems? To really focus on what is the need? Are we developing it just because we can? Are we really addressing a certain clinical need? And the second part is contextualize. Are we really taking into consideration all of the patient population that this will affect? And this will include having developers who are working on these systems to be from diverse backgrounds, to really have an understanding of what is going on at the ground. And then the last part would be to develop data sets that are equitable, that represent the way we exist in the society. And the idea would be to really, not equality, because that doesn't really serve our purpose for the most things. We can't really have one size for everyone, because every single person, every single patient has different needs, has different issues that they are concerned with. So we really need to develop these technologies in a way that is user-friendly and human-centered, rather than having a blanket, one-size-fits-all approach to these issues. At the end, I'm looking forward to discussing more of these issues, but to just have this in mind, that we really need to pay more attention to how these technologies are going to affect patients, because this may seem like a technological matter, this may seem like a policy issue, but what is really at stake is us as humans, and what is the connection between the patients and the physicians. Thank you.
We're going to have a little bit of a panel discussion with both of these speakers, but before we do, we wanted to actually open it up to the audience and see if any of you had any questions on the presentations that you've seen so far. Sure.
My name is Monica with Maternity Health. I wanted to talk to you a little bit. I work in privacy, so The issue with Facebook asking healthcare entities, Stanford Health in particular, the American Cardiology Association, for de-identified data with the full intent of re-identifying it with Facebook data. So nefarious, greater good, so someone's clearly trying to circumvent HIPAA, came out. I haven't heard that they've restarted it, but I'm sure they are. Kind of in a quieter way. So when you talk about the data and equitable, and then really a lot of patients have no clue that their data is going to any of the places that it goes right now. And I think if they did, a lot more would object, which puts us in a bad way because the EHRs aren't set up to do that right now. So any thoughts?
Yeah, so this is on, yes? Yes. For those of you who don't know this story, Facebook was in negotiations. This was revealed that Facebook was in negotiations with hospitals in the Bay Area where they would just ship out all their de-identified data, which strips off all the HIPAA protection to Facebook. And Facebook was like, yeah, it's pretty cool because we can re-identify it. We've got lots of information. And they were completely explicit that this was the plan. This was not a secret plan. I mean, the whole plan was secret, but to the hospitals, they're like, yes, we're going to take these data and then re-identify it. And then the idea was, we'll take these data, re-identify it, and then find connections and useful things between the social media data that we have and the health data that you have, and use them for potentially interesting things, like potentially useful things, like say, here's a patient with a history of depression. That patient hasn't seen their physician in 6 months, which is fine, sure. But now we're looking at that patient's social media activity, and all of a sudden they're using lots more sad words, and they're not posting about hanging out with friends anymore. Maybe this is time for an intervention. And in fact, Facebook has like a anti-suicide intervention team, and as other social media groups do. So there's a potential to see something you can say, wow, that really could actually help care, but it's also super creepy and Big Brother-y, except that Big Brother is, large companies and not the government. So nefarious? I don't have an answer. That's part of the problem for me is the system is set up in such a way that the way to do things that look like they could have a really potentially good outcome is workarounds. And the way to do things with health data and try to be innovative in a way that could potentially help a lot of people is, well, let's work around HIPAA because HIPAA won't let us do things that we think are actually going to be good. And the workarounds seem really sketchy, and they also create lots of their own problems. So I think I'm in favor of innovative solutions, but the workarounds that get us there are really problematic, and I think probably the answer is to figure out a way to make data more available for doing more good things and prioritize that a bit more so that the system's more sensible rather than shut it all down. Probably more than you wanted.
Thanks. Jennifer Bernstein with the Network for Public Health Law. And so you were talking about the infrastructure investments and data broker role and the government and the role that they could play. And you cited FDA as your example, and I find that a really interesting example. And so I wonder if you could elaborate on that. And my thinking is because in my experience, the FDA is very industry focused and not very consumer focused or I just think of examples where there's foodborne illness outbreaks and the FDA won't share information with local public health due to legal restrictions. And so what your thoughts are on why FDA might be a good role, or if you have other thoughts on that. So.
Yeah, I think right now FDA doesn't do this very much, but I think there are interesting things that they could be doing, and there's a little bit of movement in this direction. So lots of algorithms are going to come through FDA. Lots of medical algorithms will be either embedded with devices or associated with devices or devices in their own right, and therefore will have to go through an FDA approval process before they can be used, processed through interstate commerce. So FDA has already started approving some artificial intelligence products. And I think the agency is realizing this stuff's going to change too fast for us to do the standard clinical trial equals a static product thing. That's just not going to work. And so they're thinking about how do we oversee this in an effective way, and talking about using real-world data and real-world evidence and continuing oversight and continuing updates to make sure that algorithms are working the way that they should. But the current vision of that is very much internal to the agency. It's really the agency and whoever is developing it. That's, I think, the center of that. This strikes me as an opportunity for real growth. Like, I am much more a radical transparency type guy. I think oversight by not just FDA, but also physicians associations and hospitals and insurers, like lots of people should see what's coming into these systems and going out of these systems and how well they're working to be able to evaluate them from a bunch of different perspectives. And when I think about where could that be focused, I think about FDA as the most likely place, but it doesn't have to be. Like, you could imagine CMS performing a somewhat similar role. I don't think, NIH doesn't want to touch this, I don't think, but you could imagine NIH doing a similar type of thing. I think of FDA more as opportunity than, oh yeah, it's definitely going to do it right now, but I think it's a pretty exciting possibility.
It's Erin Mobley again. I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theorist, I fear, but so for Ancestry.com and things like 23andMe, he smiles already, for things like that where people are willingly and maybe unknowingly submitting large amounts of their genetic information to companies, I'm wondering if you could see in the future where a financial institution or the Department of Ed use that information for, let's say, Huntington's disease, that you can almost diagnose to the month when someone will start to get symptoms. So if you started to have symptoms at 23 years and 4 months, maybe you wouldn't be able to get a college degree because now we know that there's no way you'd be able to pay it back by the time you were actually extremely ill. Is that something that you foresee to be an issue in the future if different institutions aside from the companies that were originally intended to have this information would gain this information, whether through a breach or a large sum of money?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my wife got a 23andMe, and she's forcing me to get it because it has a lot of interesting information, but I refuse to do that right now. I actually wrote an article why I don't want to do it, just to make an argument that this is not a good idea the way it is structured right now. It's interesting that you bring up the Huntington disease case because there has been a case in the UK which is going through the legal system right now for a different reason, not genetic information, but a similar violation of privacy where this information was revealed, and it's causing a lot of problem for the UK legal system right now. But coming back to the Ancestry and 23andMe issues, I think it is a serious issue. And there are already talks between these companies and other players in the healthcare space of how to use it. And it is a cause of concern in the sense that insurance companies, for example, or pharmaceutical companies, they can take this information and they can use it to their advantage without people even knowing. And there's also a chance of triangulation. I'm sure you heard about the recent Golden State Warrior murder case, and the FBI was able to take information which was publicly available, use it with some of these Ancestry kits, and detect the person who was responsible, which was a good thing. But at the same time, you can imagine how a lot of agencies or a lot of for-profit enterprises can take this information. So I think right now we don't have enough protections in place. There are a couple of issues. One is that a lot of this demand is driven by interest because it is interesting, to see your origin, the whole story behind, your genetic makeup and all that. But there is not a lot of information of what it entails. There's not a lot of information on what are the protections in place, how responsible these companies are with your data. And you will also notice that they're giving a lot of discounts and vouchers to get people involved. Like I have a $100 discount if I do it now because she did it. So they keep pushing you towards these things, and it's still in that phase where it's all interesting and people are not really paying attention to what's going on. But I think it is a serious issue where more oversight agencies need to get involved and try to understand what is happening with it. As Nicholson mentioned before, with the Facebook thing, it's very easy to take the genetic information and use, for example, your social media history or other internet history, and to actually identify who this person is and everything. One of my professor, George Church, at the medical school has written extensively about these issues. And he has a different idea about what we could do in terms of consent, but it is very possible to detect people and to detect where they live, who they are, what they do, everything, just by having a couple of components of your data. So it is a serious issue, but unfortunately I haven't seen a lot of work being done in that space.
So I'll say just a little bit more about that. So on the legal side, there are protections for some types of discrimination. You mentioned health insurance. There is a law that specifically says you can't discriminate based on genetic information for health insurance. That's GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. But it covers health insurance and employment and not much else. And that leaves lots of interesting space for companies to do interesting things. Life insurance, by interesting I mean probably pretty bad.
Illegal.
But not, did you say illegal?
Potentially.
I think life insurers can almost certainly, if they have access to your genetic information, they can almost certainly use that to underwrite your policy or deny you a policy without any protections, except in a few very rare, I mean, maybe if you get an ADA claim, but lots of instances where you don't. This actually just gives me an opportunity to tell one of my favorite really crazy, really creepy stories about this particular instance. It's about BRCA1, BRCA2 testing, and the person about whom this story is has given me permission to share it. So this is a woman who grew up in the Netherlands, and she had a familial history of both breast and ovarian cancer, and so she got BRCA1, BRCA2 testing to find out what her potentially elevated risk was. Got it, and it turns out she had a high risk, but adopted a wait-and-see approach until she wanted to buy a house. Because it turns out that in the Netherlands, it is required by law that if you buy a house, you have to get mortgage insurance. And every mortgage insurer that she went to said, if you would like us to insure your mortgage, you must get a preventative double mastectomy. The happy ending to the story is that she moved to Denmark and now has a house. But there are lots of repercussions if we're not careful about the downstream consequences of large sets of data getting out there.
So my name's Leon Dupree. I'm a security professional, and it's always important, obviously, to be very proactive when you're watching people's data to make sure that you're trying to be able to give good information to people so that they can make good decisions about risk and some of those types of things internally and externally. In the healthcare field, which you were talking about concerning how artificial intelligence is being used, I guess that could be some of the positive things, I guess you were saying, because certain people from certain backgrounds could be neglected, but the AI would take over, you're saying, and might have the opportunity to be able to provide a more, I guess what's the word I'm looking for, a better information to make a decision, I would suppose. Is that what you were trying to say?
Yeah, reducing errors and better diagnosis, earlier diagnosis, better screening. But it wouldn't necessarily, those are sort of the advantages that are available, but I'm not sure it would affect all people from all backgrounds because of how the data sets are currently used.
Yeah, I mean, the potential there is we can say, oh, here's a patient that lives in a place where there's not an ophthalmologist within 200 miles, but it turns out you can get 40% of the functionality of an ophthalmologist in an app on your smartphone, because AI can power that and can look at a picture of your eye and say, oh, wow, like, here's a problem, do this. That's possible, and that could actually expand the provision of care a lot. But if, as Junaid was saying, the data are developed only from a set of people that don't look like people that are living in rural places or whatever, then you're not going to see that promise.
And it's interesting you brought that up. University of Michigan, there's a physician there at the Kellogg Center for Eye Diseases, and they recently published their work, highlighted their work using a smartphone camera and an AI software which can be used by primary care physicians and others in earlier diagnosis of diabetic retinopathy. So, which would be great if it was generalized and a lot of people had access to it, because then you don't if the accuracy rate is high, you don't always need to see an ophthalmologist. Even your PCPs can sort of get an understanding of what is the condition of your retina, and if they detect something, then they can refer you. So, so I think there's a lot of potential in that space.
Okay, I was just really curious about it. I thought it was good because my sister-in-law is a doctor. She's a graduate from MSU. She's a DO, Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine, or whatever they want to call it. And when she transferred down to, I think, North Carolina, she had patients that she was picking up, and she was diagnosing them. But she wasn't an MD. She wasn't a real doctor, of course. But she was diagnosing them and finding out things that were wrong with the patients because the doctors weren't really interacting. And she interacted with them. So, I mean, to me, I think this AI is a great opportunity because sometimes things slip through the cracks, that's all.
So I think I'll disagree with your characterization that a DO isn't a real doctor, but
I was joking. Because of the people are very conservative down in North Carolina. Just a little joke.
Excellent. So I agree. I think part of the really interesting thing about AI is kind of how it can shift what it is that doctors do when they interact with patients. Nobody's thinking doctors should be replaced by AI, but the goal is that it says, hey, here's a bunch of stuff you spend time learning and doing that actually a machine's probably better at. And you should be doing stuff that machines aren't better at, like talking to patients as people and figuring out what they really want and what their real preferences are, and memorizing a list of symptoms so you can do a good differential diagnosis. Humans aren't going to be the best at that very soon. And so the question is kind of how do we think about taking these computer programs, which can learn to do some things really well, and put them into the medical system in such a way that they don't screw it up, they don't create huge sets of bias so that some people get really crappy care, and they let doctors do the stuff that really doctors should be doing and I think want to be doing.
Yeah.
It's a cool possible vision. It's just the question is how exactly do we get there?
So, Bharat Gandhi from MiHIN. I did want to follow up on the point that you just made. When you think about artificial intelligence and who would be providing that, I think about the big data people. Certainly an opportunity to monetize technology. What challenges and hurdles do you see with respect to adopting that, having these big players in that space, and how that will impact us with respect to overall healthcare?
I think some of the challenges are, first of all, the data quantity. I think that is a big challenge in some of the implementation of these technologies because, for example, if you take some of the software that is using diagnosis for diabetic retinopathy, you need 130,000 images for the model to learn a few diagnostic techniques. And then for, let's say, the skin lesions, you need 135,000. So the first aspect, the first challenge would be the quantity of data when you are going for patients who have diabetes, for example, or other chronic diseases. Can we really have enough data and enough clean data with high dimensionality where you can actually predict certain outcomes? The second thing would be quality. Data quality would be a big challenge because right now different electronic health records have different sort of when it comes to specificity and how much information they have, it's very different. The third and a very important challenge would be the interpretation of the model. So right now, there are a couple of issues with generalizability. One of them is the model bias. As I mentioned before, if you have trained the model on certain population that does not take into account different minorities, for example, or other populations, then the output would be biased. And at the same time, if there are health systems using different EHRs, then it is difficult for the model to learn because it's getting conflicting information. So some of these are, and there's a paper written by Nicholson about black box, about how a lot of these outputs are, they're not really clear because they are end-to-end learning systems. So it's not really clear how the system has come to a certain prediction compared to how a physician usually comes to a certain prediction, where they take clinical, social, and other histories into account. So these are some of the challenges that are still, that still need to be addressed.
I'll mention a couple of challenges from a different direction, because I think about this stuff from kind of an orthogonal direction. I think payment models is a big challenge for adoption. Like, how are we actually going to pay for these technologies, especially in terms of kind of what's the monetization strategy for big tech coming into this? The problem that I see here is that the really obvious monetization strategy and the really obvious payment model focuses on kind of second opinion tweakings for really expensive diseases, kind of point of care. Here it is, we're gonna get, we're gonna use some proprietary algorithm to figure out the ideal chemotherapeutic for you, and we're just gonna lop that on with an extra big chunk of money. That strikes me as the most obvious way to get money for AI, but that's not what'll have the biggest impact in terms of actually providing care and in terms of providing care to lots of people. And so the question is kind of, where does this fit, or a question for me is, where does this fit into the landscape of kind of direct consumer products versus insurance reimbursables, something that's kind of underlying the system versus like a one-off purchase. I think that's a really interesting set of issues that I really haven't seen much being talked about yet. There are lots of other things, but that's one of the ones that jumps to mind for me right now.
Hi, Summer Ort, MiHIN. Thank you both for your presentations. I was just wondering if in your research you found any AI either in use or maybe in the conceptual phase that you believe does incorporate all of those populations and is inclusive.
So far, there's just been a couple of devices that have been approved by the FDA for regular use, but they're both assisting rather than replacing the function of a physician. And at the same time, the other challenge with these devices is that you need to let them work to actually learn, compared to, for example, let's say a drug, a certain cancer drug. There's a long process before it goes to the market. Clinical trials and other studies to really understand the safety or other issues with it. But with AI, the challenge is often, and I think that's what the FDA has also recognized, is that if you worry so much, or if you keep impeding it so much, then it's going to be difficult because the model needs to learn. So that is a challenge which is still prevalent. So there haven't really been a lot of examples, except for the one, for example, I mentioned, where you do see different patient populations with different characteristics. So for example, one of the AI devices that was recently approved was for a fracture. It would assist a radiologist to diagnose a fracture. But for that, it's improbable to have different characteristics. But where it would be applicable is if there is an AI device that is using the way a person speaks and the dialect and their accent, and if it is trained with a certain population, like I was mentioning, the Winterlight labs, they trained it on a certain population in Canada who speaks in a certain way, and they actually saw that other Canadians, for example, immigrants or others, even Canadians from different provinces who did not speak in that dialect, the software did not detect their language. So it would not be able to diagnose them. They were trying to understand Alzheimer's risk. So that is a potential challenge, but it would depend on the device and what it is trying to do. And if it is trying to use images, then it would be less likely. But if it is trying to use personal characteristics for the output, then it would be more likely to have that sort of bias unless we're very careful from the beginning.
I'll basically agree that I think no, I haven't seen any that have dealt with that issue yet. I'll also share that so that there's like the problem with the opacity, the models, the end-to-end opacity is that, and as you mentioned, like you can have AI that's learning from the wrong things. It might be really good at predicting something, but it's predicting based on the totally incorrect part of the data that you're giving it. So there was an example where AI was trained to, now I'm forgetting what it was used to diagnose. Something in an X-ray, and it turned out that what it was doing was noticing which X-rays came from a portable chest X-ray and which X-rays came from a fixed chest X-ray. And it turns out the patients that get a portable chest X-ray are very different from the patients that get a fixed chest X-ray. And so it was great at doing that prediction, but it didn't actually tell you anything that you really wanted to know about the patients.
Dr. Nabi, you've done a wonderful job of outlining at a high level the issues with data sets that are not diverse enough. From my reading and understanding, a lot of the reasons for this have to do with breaches in trust historically with the US government as well as various researchers over the past 80 or 90 years that have caused a lot of this to happen. What do you suggest to help those data sets become more inclusive? My understanding is that some of the reasoning is that minority populations do not wish to participate for these historical reasons, thus contributing to the problem. Thank you.
That's a great question and a very important one. And I was reminded of it last year when the Boston Globe did a really extensive study in Boston hospitals. We have a lot of really good hospitals in Boston, but you would be surprised at how we are terrible at taking care of all sorts of people. And there are a lot of historical reasons why certain populations prefer certain hospitals and try to avoid certain hospitals because of those reasons. I think, as I mentioned, one of the points, one way to do it is having developers, people who are designing these things, having a diverse background in that as well, rather than just having people who, and that would take some systematic effort. For example, if we have a certain company devising a certain device or software, it would be useful to have people on that team who come from different backgrounds so they can inform that and they can engage with those populations. Because there's a lot of research to show that when there are physicians or other practitioners who understand that community, who can relate to them, who can speak with them and understand their perspective, minority populations and others are more likely to participate and engage in these endeavors. So that would be one way to address this issue. The other one would be similar to clinical trials. The NIH mandates certain breakup of how people are being included into those trials. We could have a similar policy in which if you are running or if you are trying to design a certain software, then we need to mandate, we need to make sure that they are having enough community engagement efforts into getting all sorts of communities involved with these efforts.
This shows up on the infrastructure side too. So the All of Us initiative is actually quite conspicuous about saying we really want a representative population, and they have specific goals for minority population and socioeconomic status diversity. And so they're trying quite hard to bring in as many folks as they can into that kind of infrastructural data set.
Any final questions? Great.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Michelle Markey from New Jersey Innovation Institute. And I noticed, Dr. Nabi, you had a slide picture of Google AI. And I'm just wondering if you, as the panelists, believe that industry oligopolists like Google and Apple are leading the charge towards increasing equity in the application and growth of AI.
That's a great question, and I think I'm not sure about how if they are leading the equity issue, but they are definitely leading in terms of innovation and in terms of getting much more involved in academic centers. Google recently filed a patent using electronic health records to make certain predictions. So they are really far ahead in terms of what they can do with AI. They're really getting involved with the healthcare aspect, and because they have the infrastructure and they have the knowledge and the capacity to do these things, I think they are taking a lead. I'm not sure what they are doing in terms of equity, in terms of making sure that the communities are represented. And I think for them right now, it's more about the innovation aspect and the idea. Can we really do it? Can we really implement some of these ideas? Can we have partnerships with medical centers to really make it happen? I think they're concerned. I think it's a very, very initial. I think they're still in a very introductory phase of this implementation. But they do have the capacity, and because they are filing patents, they are getting involved. I think they will emerge as some of the key players in the future.
I think they're definitely key players. I think they're very far from leading on the equity front. It's possible that they're doing lots of things behind the scenes that I don't see, but I don't see much.